Swiss A220-300 Cockpit landing through storm at Milan Malpensa. You're not capable of handling this aircraft in these conditions. I'm calling for an emergency diversion. Thomas, I've landed through worse storms than this in aircraft twice as heavy. Trust the training and trust me. The Airbus A220-300 shuddered violently as another gust slammed into its composite fuselage. Captain Elena Martinelli kept her hands steady on the side stick, her eyes fixed on the primary flight display as the aircraft bucked and yawed through the turbulent air. Rain hammered against the cockpit windows with such force it sounded like gravel being thrown at sheet metal. Outside, the world had disappeared into a wall of gray. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the storm clouds from within like a photographer's flash behind a curtain. First Officer Thomas Brenner's face had gone pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his seat. The ground proximity warning system had been calling out altitude warnings for the past 30 seconds, the automated voice cutting through the cockpit with mechanical urgency. 100, 50, 40, 30. Elena could feel Thomas's panic radiating from the right seat like heat from a furnace. This was his first real storm landing, and it showed. But there was no time for reassurance, no time for gentle coaching. They were at 500 feet, descending through wind shear that was trying to tear the aircraft from the sky, with 137 souls aboard depending on her to get this right. The airport was down there somewhere, buried beneath the chaos. Milan Malpensa's runway 35R, 9,842 feet of concrete that might as well have been on another planet for all she could see of it. The instrument landing system was giving them guidance, but the crosswinds were 43 knots, gusting to 55 well beyond what the aircraft manufacturer recommended for landing, and dancing right on the edge of what company regulations permitted. WNDSHEAR, 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 the aircraft's computer announced, its voice calm despite the warning it was giving. Elena's hand moved to the thrust levers, adding power even as the stick in her other hand made constant minute corrections. The A220 responded beautifully, its fly-by-wire system translating her inputs into precise movements of control surfaces she couldn't even see. "Captain, we should go around," Thomas said again, his voice tight with fear he was trying hard to mask. "Weather is below minimums. Como is reporting clear skies. We can be there in 20 minutes. But Elena knew what Thomas didn't. Couldn't know, not yet. "We're landing here," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that ended discussions. "Set the auto brake to maximum." Her eyes flicked to the radar altimeter. 250 feet. The runway had to be close now, just below the cloud base they were about to break through. If they broke through. If the visibility was what Tower had reported and not worse. If the wind didn't shift at the last second and push them off the center line. If 1,000 small things went right instead of wrong. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 5 hours earlier when Elena Martinelli walked into the crew briefing room at Zurich Airport, and nothing about the day suggested it would become one of the most challenging flights of her 32-year career. The morning had begun like thousands of others before it. Elena arrived at Zurich Airport at 0700, her car sliding into the crew parking lot as the sun cast long shadows across the tarmac. September in Switzerland meant crisp mornings and the first hints of autumn color in the trees that lined the airport perimeter. She carried her flight bag over her shoulder, the same bag she'd carried since her days flying for Crossair in the 1990s, now worn but still serviceable, like Elena herself. At 58 years old, Captain Elena Martinelli was one of the most senior pilots at Swiss. She'd learned to fly in the Italian Air Force, back when being a woman in a cockpit was rare enough to make headlines. Her father had been a mechanic for Alitalia, spending his life with his hands inside engines, and he'd passed on to his daughter a love of flight that transcended the mechanical. When she'd told him she wanted to be a pilot, not a flight attendant, he'd smiled and said, "Then be the best pilot they've ever seen." She'd tried to honor that promise every day since. The crew briefing room was quiet this early, just a handful of pilots and flight attendants preparing for the first wave of departures. Elena poured herself an espresso from the machine-reel espresso, not the watered-down coffee the Americans drank, and checked the flight roster. LX1634, Zurich to Milan Malpensa. Departure at 09:30, arrival at 10:40 local time. The Airbus A220-300, tail number HBJCK, a beautiful aircraft just 3 years old with only 8,000 flight hours on the airframe. The A220 was Elena's favorite in the Swiss fleet, responsive, efficient, modern. Bombardier had designed it brilliantly before Airbus bought the program, and every time Elena flew it, she appreciated the engineering that had gone into its creation. The passenger load was listed at 137, nearly full for the 150-seat configuration. Cargo was within limits. Nothing remarkable. Just another short hop across the Alps to Italy, the kind of flight Elena could do in her sleep. She was reviewing the weather briefing when Thomas Brenner walked in. "Good morning, Captain," he said, his German accent crisp and formal. Thomas was 31, blonde, precise in his movements and his speech. He'd been flying for Swiss for 4 years, all of it on the A220, but this was only his 3rd flight with Elena. She'd flown with him twice before, once to Barcelona, once to London, and had found him competent but cautious. Perhaps too cautious. He flew by the book, which wasn't a bad thing, but Elena believed the book was a starting point, not a finish line. "Good morning, Thomas," Elena replied, gesturing to the chair beside her. "Have you looked at the weather?" Thomas set down his flight bag and pulled out his tablet, calling up the meteorological reports. "Zurich is clear. Milan shows scattered clouds at 3,000 feet, visibility 10 kilometers. Looks like a straightforward flight." Elena nodded, but something in the data troubled her. "Look at the TAF for Milan. The terminal aerodrome forecast shows possible thunderstorms developing after 1100 local. We land at 10:40, so we should beat them. But check the latest METAR reports every 15 minutes once we're airborne. Weather in the Po Valley can change fast this time of year." Thomas made a note on his tablet. "Understood, Captain." They spent the next 20 minutes going through the flight planning together. The route would take them south from Zurich, over the Alps. Elena loved this part of the flight, watching the peaks slide by below, remembering her younger days when she'd done mountain flying in smaller aircraft, then down into the broad, flat expanse of the Po Valley where Milan sprawled. Flight time would be just under an hour. They'd burn 11,000 pounds of fuel, landing with comfortable reserves. Thomas's voice was nearly a shout now. "Go around! Go around!" Elena's hand hovered over the TOGA button, take off, go around, the red button that would command the engines to full power and initiate the go-around procedure. Every fiber of her being was screaming at her to push it, to abort this approach, to climb away from the danger and live to try again another day. But still she hesitated. Why? What was she trying to prove? That she was as good as any man. That age hadn't diminished her skills. That she could handle anything thrown at her. Or was it simpler than that? Was it just that she'd told that arrogant passenger she would get him to Milan, and some part of her refused to break that promise? 600 feet, 500 feet, and then through the rain and clouds she saw them, the rabbit lights, the approach lighting system, white lights leading toward the runway threshold. A moment later, the runway itself appeared, the centerline lights glowing in the darkness, beckoning them home. "Runway in sight," she called out. "I see it," Thomas confirmed, his voice tight. 400 feet. The Windshear warning was still sounding, the aircraft still fighting her, but the runway was there, solid and real. Elena made a series of rapid corrections, compensating for the crosswind that was trying to push them right of centerline. The A220's nose was pointed nearly 20 degrees off the runway heading, the aircraft crabbing sideways through the air to maintain its ground track. 300 feet, 200 feet. The ground rose up to meet them. Elena could see the runway markings clearly now, could see the standing water on the concrete, the rain bouncing off in a silvery spray. She began the flare, pulling back on the side stick to raise the nose, bleeding off airspeed, preparing to, and then it hit them. A massive gust of wind, 60 knots or more, slamming into the aircraft from the right side. The A220 rolled violently left, the left wing dropping toward the ground. Elena reacted on pure instinct, full right stick and full right rudder, commanding the flight control computers to level the wings immediately. The aircraft responded, rolling back level, but they were off centerline now, drifting left toward the edge of the runway. Elena applied more right rudder, more right stick. The runway was rushing up at them, too fast, too close, 100 feet. Which brought us back to where our story began, Captain Elena Martinelli fighting to save her aircraft and everyone aboard it, while her first officer questioned her judgment and their lives hung in the balance. 100, 50, 40, 30, the automated callouts continued, counting down the feet separating them from the ground. Elena's world had narrowed to a single point of focus, keeping the aircraft on the runway centerline, managing the descent rate, compensating for the crosswind. Her hands and feet moved in concert, making dozens of tiny corrections every second, adjusting for each gust, each shift in the wind. 20, 10. At the last possible moment, Elena kicked in left rudder, straightening the aircraft's nose to align with the runway, then immediately reversed it back to the right to prevent them from drifting off centerline. It was a technique called a wing-low crosswind landing, keeping the upwind wing low to prevent drift, then straightening just before touchdown. The main landing gear kissed the concrete with surprising gentleness. Elena immediately deployed the thrust reversers, the engines roaring as they redirected their power forward to slow the aircraft. She applied the brakes, gentle at first, then firmer, feeling the anti-skid system pulsing under her feet as it prevented the wheels from locking on the wet surface. The A220 decelerated rapidly, the airspeed bleeding off, and Elena felt the aircraft settle onto its nose gear. They were down. They were safe. Reversers deployed, auto-brake engaged, Thomas called out, his voice shaking with either relief or residual fear, possibly both. Elena guided the aircraft down the runway, the centerline lights sliding beneath them until they reached the high-speed turnoff. She reduced power, retracted the thrust reversers, and turned onto the taxiway. Her hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Swiss 1634, exit runway, contact ground on 121.755, the tower controller said. If he was impressed or concerned by what he just witnessed, his voice gave no indication. Welcome to Milan. Over to ground, Swiss 1634, Thomas replied. Then off the radio, he turned to Elena. Captain, that was. Unacceptable, Elena finished for him. Her voice was steady, but inside she was shaking too. Thomas, you were right, we should have diverted. I put everyone aboard at risk because of. She paused, searching for the right words. Because of pride. Because I let a difficult passenger and my own stubbornness override my better judgment. I'm sorry. Thomas stared at her for a moment, surprise evident on his young face. Captain, we're down safely. You made the landing, that's what matters. No, Elena said firmly. What matters is that we got lucky. Skill put us in position, but luck got us on the ground. In those conditions, with that wind shear, we could have ended up off the runway or worse. A good pilot knows when to say no, and I didn't. That's a mistake I won't make again. They followed ground control's instructions to the gate, the A220 splashing through puddles as they taxied. The rain was still coming down hard, and lightning still flickered in the clouds above, but they were safely on the ground now. Elena felt the weight of responsibility beginning to lift from her shoulders, replaced by the heavier weight of recognition of her error, of how close they'd come to disaster. At the gate, Elena went through the shutdown checklist methodically, turning off systems in the proper sequence, securing the aircraft for its ground time. When everything was complete, she unbuckled her harness and stood, her legs unsteady after the adrenaline rush. Thomas, she said. I need you to file a full report on this landing with our chief pilot. Include your concerns about my decision-making. They need to know what happened here. Thomas's eyes widened. Captain, I can't. That would be reporting against you. Your career, my career is less important than safety, Elena said. If I made a mistake, and I did, then it needs to be documented and learned from. That's how we get better. That's how we prevent accidents. She left the cockpit and walked back through the cabin. The passengers were gathering their belongings, preparing to deplane, seemingly unaware of how close they'd come to disaster. Most people didn't understand what happened in a cockpit, didn't know how to read the subtle signs of a challenging landing. To them, it had probably just felt like a rough arrival in bad weather. The man from seat 2A was standing in the aisle, phone already pressed to his ear, conducting business before the aircraft door had even opened. When he saw Elena approaching, he lowered the phone. Well, he said, you got us here just like you promised. Maybe 15 minutes late, but I'll still make my meeting, so I suppose I owe you a thank you." Elena looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She saw the expensive suit, the carefully groomed appearance, the air of self-importance. But she also saw something else. The worry lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his free hand gripped his briefcase so tightly his knuckles were white. "Sir," she said quietly. "May I ask what your meeting was about, the one that was so important?" The man hesitated, as if deciding whether she deserved an answer. Then his expression softened slightly. "My daughter. She's in a hospital here in Milan. She was in a car accident 3 days ago, critical condition. I've been flying back and forth from Zurich, trying to manage my business while being there for her. This morning's meeting is with her doctors to discuss whether to. His voice caught. Whether to keep her on life support. Elena felt something shift inside her chest. All the anger she'd felt toward this man, all the resentment at his demands, his arrogance, his threats, dissolved in an instant. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I didn't know. How could you?" The man's voice was bitter, but the bitterness seemed directed at himself now, not at Elena. "I didn't tell anyone, I couldn't miss that meeting. I needed to be there for her. She's all I have left since my wife passed." "What's your daughter's name?" Elena asked gently. "Sophia, she's 28. She was driving home from work when a truck ran a red light. The doctors say even if she survives, she might never wake up." The man's hand shook as he raised it to his face. "I should have been nicer to everyone today, to you, to the flight attendants. I've just been so angry at the world, so angry that this happened to her. She didn't deserve it. She's a good person, Captain, better than her father." Elena reached out and touched his arm gently. "Go," she said. "Go be with your daughter. And regardless of what the doctors say, don't give up hope. I've seen too many impossible things happen in my life to believe anything is truly hopeless." The man nodded, unable to speak, and hurried off the aircraft. Elena watched him go, feeling something profound settling over her. How quick she'd been to judge him, to label him as just another entitled businessman. How quickly she'd let her pride and irritation override her compassion. Maria appeared beside her. "Captain, are you all right?" Elena turned to her longtime colleague. "Maria, did you know about that passenger, about his daughter?" "Not until just now," Maria said. "He told me while we were waiting to deplane. He apologized for his behavior, said the stress was making him act like someone he didn't want to be." She paused. "Captain, can I say something?" "Of course." "That landing, I've been flying for 18 years and I've never felt anything like that. The turbulence, the way the aircraft rolled right before touchdown, how bad was it up there?" Elena met her eyes honestly. "Bad enough that we should have diverted, bad enough that I made a mistake continuing the approach. I'm going to be filing a full report." Maria's expression was thoughtful. "But you got us down safely. Everyone is fine. Doesn't that count for something?" "It counts for the fact that I'm a skilled pilot," Elena said. "But it doesn't excuse a poor decision. Being able to recover from a mistake doesn't mean the mistake wasn't made." She looked out the window at the rain still hammering down. "I let pride override judgment, Maria. That's how accidents happen. Not all at once, but through a chain of small mistakes, each one survivable until the one that isn't." Back in the cockpit, Thomas was completing the post-flight documentation. He looked up when Elena entered. "Captain, I've been thinking about what you said, about filing a report." "It needs to be done, Thomas." "I know, but I also need to say something else. What you did today, that landing, I couldn't have done it. I don't have the skill yet, the experience. If I'd been in the left seat, we would have diverted, yes, but only because I'm not good enough to land in those conditions. You made a judgment call. It was aggressive, maybe too aggressive, but it worked out because you had the skill to back it up." Elena sat down in her seat one more time. "Thomas, you're going to have a long career ahead of you. And somewhere in that career, you're going to face a decision like the one I faced today. You're going to have to choose between what's safe and what's possible. And when that moment comes, I want you to remember something. The best pilots aren't the ones who can pull off the most difficult landings. The best pilots are the ones who never have to because they make the decisions that keep them out of difficult situations in the first place. But you are one of the best pilots," Thomas said. "Everyone says so. Your record is spotless. 32 years without a single incident." 32 years, 11 months, and 26 days, Elena corrected with a small smile. "But who's counting?" She stood and gathered her flight bag. "Come on, let's get the aircraft ready for the return leg. And let's check that weather forecast. If it's still this bad this afternoon, we're not leaving until it clears." The return flight to Zurich that afternoon was delayed by 3 hours while they waited for the storm system to move through. Elena didn't mind. She spent the time in the crew room, writing her report, recounting every detail of the approach and landing. She didn't minimize her mistakes or try to justify them. She simply told the truth. She had let personal pride and external pressure influence her decision-making, and while the outcome had been successful, the process had been flawed. When she finally submitted the report, she felt oddly relieved, lighter somehow. As if acknowledging her error had released something she'd been carrying for years, the burden of always having to prove herself, of never being allowed to make mistakes because every mistake would be seen as evidence that a woman, that an older pilot, didn't belong in the cockpit. The flight back to Zurich was smooth and uneventful, exactly the kind of flight Elena usually preferred. Thomas handled most of the flying, and Elena supervised and coached, pointing out small details she'd learned over the years. She found herself enjoying the teaching aspect, sharing knowledge with the next generation. As they began their descent into Zurich, Thomas said, "Captain, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Why did you become a pilot? What made you choose this career?" Elena thought about her father, about growing up in the shadow of Malpensa Airport, watching aircraft take off and land, feeling in her bones that she belonged up there among the clouds. "When I was a little girl," she said, "my father used to take me to the airport to watch the planes. He'd point out the different types, explain how the engines worked, how the wings created lift. And I remember thinking that flying was the closest thing to magic that humans had ever invented, metal and fuel and physics combining to defeat gravity itself." She paused, adjusting their descent rate. "But more than that, I loved the idea of responsibility. That when you're in command of an aircraft, 100, 200, 300 people are trusting you with their lives. Their safety depends on your skill, your judgment, your decisions. That's a profound responsibility, and I wanted to be worthy of it." "Are you?" Thomas asked. "Worthy of it?" Elena considered the question honestly. "Most days, yes. Today," she shook her head. "Today I fell short. But the thing about being a pilot, about being human, is that you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be willing to learn from your mistakes and do better tomorrow." They landed in Zurich as the sun was setting, painting the Alps in shades of pink and gold. Elena taxied to the gate for the last time that day, shut down the engines, and completed her final checklist. As she stood to leave the cockpit, Thomas stood as well. "Captain Martinelli," he said formally, "thank you for the lesson today. Not the lesson you intended to teach, perhaps, but the one I needed to learn." Elena smiled and shook his hand. "You're going to be a good pilot, Thomas, maybe even a great one. Just remember, the sky doesn't care about your ego. It only cares whether you respect its rules." 3 weeks later, Elena received a letter from the Swiss chief pilot's office. She opened it with trepidation, expecting a reprimand or possibly worse. Instead, she found a commendation. The letter acknowledged her report and her honest assessment of her decision-making. It noted that while the approach had been challenging and perhaps more aggressive than recommended, her skill had ensured a safe outcome. More importantly, it praised her willingness to self-report and to use the incident as a teaching opportunity. But there was more. The letter explained that based on her decades of experience and her demonstrated commitment to safety, the airline was asking her to join their advanced pilot training program as an instructor. She would continue to fly regular routes, but she would also spend time teaching other pilots, sharing her knowledge, helping to shape the next generation of aviators. Elena read the letter 3 times, feeling emotions she couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly. Relief, but also something deeper, a sense that perhaps her father's challenge to be the best pilot anyone had ever seen wasn't about pulling off daring landings or proving herself against skeptics. Perhaps it was about this, being honest enough to acknowledge mistakes, wise enough to learn from them, and generous enough to teach others. She called the chief pilot's office and accepted the position. That evening, Elena did something she rarely did. She visited her father's grave. He'd passed away 5 years earlier, and she tried to come at least a few times a year, but the demands of her schedule often made it difficult. The cemetery was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the headstones. She stood before his grave and told him about the landing at Milan, told him about her mistake, about her pride, about what she'd learned. She told him about the passenger and his daughter, about Thomas and his fear, about the decision to file the report and the unexpected outcome. "I hope I made you proud, Papa," she said softly. "Not because I made a perfect landing in impossible conditions, but because I was honest about making a mistake. I think that's what you really meant when you told me to be the best pilot they'd ever seen. Not the most skilled, but the most honest, the most human." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn. In the distance, Elena could hear the sound of an aircraft passing overhead, likely on approach to Zurich. She looked up, watching its lights blink against the darkening sky, and felt a familiar pull the magic that had captured her as a child and never let go. She would fly again tomorrow, and the day after that, and for as many days as her health and skill and the airline would allow. But she would fly differently now, with a deeper understanding that skill alone wasn't enough. That judgment, humility, and the courage to admit error were just as important as any technical ability. As for the passenger from seat 2A, whose name, she'd learned from the airline records, was Marco Bellini, Elena never saw him again on her flights. But 6 weeks after that stormy landing in Milan, she received a letter addressed to her at Swiss headquarters. It was from Marco. He wrote to tell her that his daughter Sophia had woken up. Against all odds, against the doctor's expectations, she had opened her eyes 3 days after he'd flown with Elena. She faced a long recovery, months of rehabilitation, but she was alive and fighting, and the doctors were now optimistic about her prognosis. "I don't know if it was prayer or luck or just the mysterious workings of the universe," Marco wrote, "but I do know this. You got me to that hospital when I needed to be there. You fulfilled your promise despite conditions that would have justified breaking it. I was wrong to put that pressure on you, wrong to be so demanding, but I'm grateful that you rose to the challenge. My daughter is alive, and I got to be there for her when she needed me most. Thank you, Captain Martinelli. Thank you for not giving up." Elena kept that letter in her flight bag, tucked into the same pocket where she kept her father's old mechanic's license. Some days, when flights were difficult or passengers were challenging or the weather was testing her resolve, she would take it out and read it again. Not because it justified her decisions that day. It didn't, and she knew it, but because it reminded her why she flew. Every passenger had a story. Every flight was carrying someone to something important, a business meeting, yes, but also a reunion, a farewell, a beginning, an ending. And her job was to get them there safely, not heroically. Safely was enough. Safely was everything. Thomas, for his part, became one of Elena's most dedicated students when she began her instructor role. He would seek her out between flights, asking questions, discussing scenarios, learning not just the technical skills of flying, but the judgment required to use those skills wisely. Years later, when he earned his own command and took his first flight as captain, Elena was in the right seat beside him as a Czech pilot, watching him fly with the same cautious precision that had once frustrated her, but which she now recognized as the foundation of good airmanship. On the day of her retirement, 35 years after she'd first soloed an aircraft, 33 years after joining Swiss, Elena was asked to give a speech to the new pilot trainees. They sat before her, young and eager, their eyes full of dreams and confidence. She looked at them and saw herself 3 decades earlier, certain that skill and determination could overcome any obstacle. "I want to tell you about a flight," she began, and she told them about Milan. Told them about the storm, the crosswinds, the windshear. Told them about her mistake and what it had taught her. "The most important thing I learned in my career," she said, "is that being a good pilot isn't about what you can do. It's about knowing what you shouldn't do. It's about having the courage to say no when the situation demands it, even when saying yes would be easier or more impressive or would satisfy an impatient passenger." She paused, looking around the room. "You're going to face moments where your skills will be tested, where the weather is bad or the aircraft is malfunctioning or the pressure to continue is intense. And in those moments, you'll have to make a choice between what's possible and what's right. I'm telling you now, choose right, every time. Because the most challenging landing you'll ever make isn't the one in the worst weather. It's the landing where you choose safety over ego, where you choose wisdom over pride. The sky," she finished, "will always be there. Another day, another approach, another chance. But the lives in your hands, they only get one chance. Never forget that. The trainees applauded, and Elena stepped down from the podium. As she walked out of the training center for the last time as an active pilot, she felt the same mix of emotions she'd felt reading the chief pilot's letter years earlier. Pride, relief, and something deeper, a sense of completion, of a journey well-traveled despite its imperfections. She drove to the airport not to work but simply to watch, parking in the observation area where families and aviation enthusiasts gathered to see the planes take off and land. An A220 thundered down the runway and lifted into the air, climbing steeply into the clear Swiss sky. Elena watched it go, remembering the feel of the controls, the sound of the engines, the responsibility and joy of flight. Behind her, she heard a child's voice. "Papa, I want to be a pilot when I grow up." Elena turned and saw a little girl, maybe 7 years old, her face pressed against the fence, watching the aircraft with the same wonder Elena had felt at that age. The father smiled and ruffled his daughter's hair. "That's a big dream, sweetheart. Is it hard to become a pilot?" the girl asked. Elena stepped closer. "May I?" she asked the father, who nodded. Elena knelt beside the girl. "It's very hard," she said honestly. "You have to study mathematics and physics. You have to train for thousands of hours. You have to make difficult decisions and live with the consequences." The girl's face fell slightly, and Elena smiled. "But it's also the most wonderful thing in the world. And if you really want it, if you're willing to work for it and learn from your mistakes, then yes, you can become a pilot, a great pilot." "Are you a pilot?" the girl asked. "I was," Elena said, "for 35 years, and I loved every minute of it, even the difficult ones. Especially the difficult ones, because that's where I learned the most." She stood and nodded to the father, then walked back to her car. As she drove away from the airport, she didn't feel sadness at leaving her career behind. Instead, she felt gratitude for the opportunity to fly, for the lessons learned, for the lives she'd touched and the lives that had touched hers. The sky would go on without her. Other pilots would make the flights, face the storms, navigate the challenges. And somewhere among them, she hoped, would be pilots who understood what she'd learned that stormy day over Milan. That the greatest courage wasn't in facing danger, but in choosing wisdom. That the greatest skill wasn't in pushing limits, but in respecting them. That being the best pilot wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about having the strength to admit them and the grace to learn from them. That evening, Elena opened her logbook for the last time, the same logbook she'd started 3 decades earlier, now filled with thousands of entries recording hundreds of thousands of hours in the air. On the last page, she wrote a final entry. "Final flight, Swiss LX 1634, Zurich to Milan Malpensa and return. A220-300. Conditions challenging. Decisions made. Lessons learned. Career complete. But the sky remains, and I remain grateful for every moment I spent within it." She closed the logbook and placed it on the shelf beside her father's old mechanic's license and Marco Bellini's letter. 3 small pieces of paper that told the story of a life lived in pursuit of a dream. Outside her window, the evening sky was clear, and somewhere overhead, the sound of jet engines marked another flight, another journey, another pilot writing their own story in the air. Elena smiled and turned away from the window. The flight was over, but the lessons would last forever. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.